Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Art Murmur against cultural imperialism, Rasheed Araeen's 1970s art practice. Thank you for joining. We have with us artists Peter Fillingham and Majella Dowdican, who have collaborated with Areen over the last decade, and we're very excited for this talk. Before we begin, I just want to touch on some housekeeping things. Please keep your microphones and videos off during the session. This session is being recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube in the coming weeks. This conversation will be hosted for an hour, and we will open for questions in the last 15 minutes. You will receive a prompt from me when we want questions. Please type them up in the chat, and I will read them out to the panelists. I think we have enough participants, and just to be efficient with time, I will start with the introductions. So, my name is Kuhu Kopariha.
No.
Many of you, yeah, that was enough. Okay. So, I'm Kuhu Kopariha. I'm the program manager at Art South Asia Project. Many of you may not have seen me. Art South Asia Project, or ASAP, is a UK-based not-for-profit established in 2021. We support the infrastructure of modern and contemporary visual and applied arts in South Asia by facilitating and expanding regional and international networks of collaboration and research. We work we foster regional collaborations between countries of Bangladesh, India, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka. It is my great pleasure to introduce Majella Dowdican, who is an Irish artist based in London. She holds a master's degree in fine arts from Central St. Martin's. Her practice is interdisciplinary, using sculpture, installation, and drawing to reflect on and critique injustice and authoritarianism. In addition to this, Dowdican works as a studio manager and personal assistant for Rasheed Araeen. She is key to facilitating the making of artworks, projects, and research. She considers Araeen both a dear friend and a mentor. Peter Fillingham works primarily with found materials, things that might be perceived as having low culture or economic value, transforming them into sculptural forms and object-based installations that carry a sense of theatricality. His practice is rooted in the margins, both geographically and materially, where art exists with everyday life. Fillingham's work explores the structures, colors, and systems that operate between the scenes in spaces of transit, trade, and everyday exchange, the in between zones, where colors are haphazard and materials form unintentional sculptural events. Fillingham's biracial heritage has deeply influenced his practice, drawing him towards both the formal language of sculpture and the makeshift, the ephemeral, and the improvised. Fillingham has worked with Rasheed Araeen since 2011 and has played a major role in the technical management of his projects and exhibitions. Thank you both for joining us today. It is lovely to see you guys. And before I hand over the stage to you for presentations, I'm also going to give an introduction to the man who needs no introduction, Rasheed Araeen. Rasheed Araeen is a London-based conceptual artist. He has produced works for 6 decades now, contributing as a sculptor, painter, writer, curator, and critic. Areen's interaction with modernism and sculpture began in Karachi in 1959, which he continued developing upon his arrival in London in 1964. A few years later, Araeen joined the Black Panther movement and started negotiating the relationship between his artistic sensibilities and political consciousness. Navigating this relationship, the artist produced conceptual art, performances, and publications like The Black Phoenix, The Third Text, Making Myself Visible, and many more. Thank you. Over to you guys.
Thank you very much, Kuhu, for such a lovely and generous introduction. And yeah, I think I can speak for both myself and Peter in saying it's an honor to be here to speak about Rasheed and his work. So yeah, we've put together a little presentation. So we might ask if it's okay, Kuhu, if you begin sharing, and then we'll begin.
Let me know if you can see the screen.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, just to give a little bit of background on how we're going to approach this. I will start by kind of laying some of the context of Rasheed's work and how it kind of moves and transitions from object-based works to move into the more politicized pieces, and how that came about more by having to rather than being a choice, essentially. And then Peter, my wonderful and esteemed colleague, will kind of move on from that and talk more about the critical writings of Rasheed, where they find themselves during the 70s, but also how they've moved on to current situation and how we can integrate that and push that further as well if the work isn't done. So I will start on my first slide. If that's okay. So yeah, as I mentioned, I'll talk a little bit first just to give the context of Rasheed and his work. So up until 1959 and just before this, Rasheed was creating work that was kind of more representational. It was moving towards abstraction, but a lot of it took the form of paintings and yeah, like, as I say, representational work. During this time, Pakistan, the newly formed country, had kind of gone through a lot of change, and Rasheed was growing up through that. Within that change, Karachi in particular, as a modern city, was seen as a progressive centre in South Asia, and how it kind of embraced also modernism and how it saw modernism at the time. A new bourgeois class had kind of emerged at that time, and the emphasis was on modernism itself. Within that context, Rasheed himself, he was more interested in modernism in the sense of architecture. He studied as a civil engineer, and he kind of studied more so the modernism from that perspective, although he was obviously growing up and living in a culture that you know, saw this as a progressive move. And then during this time, Rasheed also started to become interested in modernism from writers such as Roger Fry and Herbert Reed. So he was also reading and writing down sentences and kind of things that they had been talking about in their work, which was also influencing how he was dealing with materials and how he was thinking about modernism, but not from an avant-garde kind of perspective. This wasn't something that was kind of in his realm at the time. But when he made my first sculpture, he speaks about it saying that he actually made it based on an intuitive kind of instinct that he had. He saw this burning tire. He took the piece he was interested in the kind of structure itself. It was only when he took it home that he realized and put it on the table, sat back and saw it within the context of modernism, which he was kind of awakening to in the art history context. So that was kind of one of his first pieces that could probably be seen as like a shift in his work. And then I'm just going to quickly move on to the next slide, where at this time as well, from reading about modernism from Fry and Reed, he also was starting to, within his works that he'd been previously making that were more representational, particularly he was making works about boats, and he saw the structures of the sails of the boats, and they were influencing now how he saw his sculptural work and abstraction as well. So he began slowly in the early 60s making some of his very first structures. and that kind of lent itself onto or coincided at the same time as he moved to the UK. So on the next slide, you'll see in 1964, Rasheed moved to the UK. And at the time when he arrived, racism was everywhere, it was spirited, and most importantly, it was legal. So this was the new context that Rasheed found himself in. He was still, well, he had a job with BP working as a civil engineer, but he was also practicing as an artist at the time, continuing with his structures and, yeah, kind of obsessively, actually, as he says himself, studying Anthony Caro's work as well. So trying to kind of understand the history of art and where he found himself in the world. At this time, he didn't actually see the two things connected. So he saw his art practice as separate from the racism that he was experiencing. One prominent example of the racism that he faced was when he was trying to find accommodation when he came to London. He was confronted with the signs that said no blacks, no coloreds. So, you know, this is kind of the sphere he was operating within, but he had kind of kept the two things separate in his mind. So during this time, he studied Anthony Caro's work quite obsessively, as he says himself, but he had no artistic or art school education, so he found historically it was difficult to kind of put those two things together. And because of this, because he didn't necessarily have the education or the context, he started to think about how he could push his own structures and make new sculptural works that would kind of push that forward. So I'll just move on to the next slide. So yeah, Rasheed continued making his structural works again during this time, and then he also was experimenting with his work, which has kind of followed through his career the whole way through. But his chakras, they were wooden circles that were floating on water. They kind of were a marriage between the geometric forms that Rasheed was dealing with, both in his sculptural works, but it also brought in elements of performance and abstraction as well. So it was kind of a nice culmination of all of those things. When Rasheed first showed this work, a lot of people saw it within the context of conceptual art. But Rasheed was kind of not particularly familiar with conceptual art. It was something, again, that he was kind of learning about, but wasn't necessarily making the works based on that, based on the idea of conceptualism. At this time, he did start to study Marcel Duchamp, who became quite a prominent influence within his work and his life. But also he started to kind of study conceptualism and start to understand, again, furthering kind of his understanding of the context. But this also coincided, which I'll move on to the next slide, all of this kind of information that Rasheed was gathering from the art world, which he kind of almost viewed as separate. He was starting to understand that actually modernism and imperialism were interlinked. There was no getting away from both things. Also, the temperature of the country and society that he found himself within, it was becoming increasingly difficult for him to ignore that and to keep his art and his identity as an artist separate from that. So in 1971, Rasheed, it was kind of seen as a turning point within his work. Rasheed read an article about the Nigerian engineering student David Olawale, who was systematically harassed by the Leeds police to the point where he ended up drowning in a river there because of this abuse from the police and the oppressive nature of how they were treating people, particularly immigrants. So Rasheed decided at that time that he wanted to make a work dedicated to Olawale, and this was a result of that. It included newspaper clippings, court documents about Olawale. A lot of it was from the kind of not the mainstream media. A lot of it came from publications that weren't in the mainstream. But he also, in his, this was the, he did one version in Camden Arts Centre, which included the letters and the court documents. But during this time, some people actually complained about the work, so he made a second version, which also included the complaints from people about showing such a work, which I just think is quite a nice addition to how he constantly was confronting the society that he found himself in. At this time as well, Rasheed was reading a lot of Frantz Fanon, and he was also getting rejected from galleries. A lot of galleries that he approached said that they loved his work, but that he wasn't English or he wasn't American. So I think Rasheed became quite disillusioned with the art world, as well as the society and the oppression that he was living under as well. So I'll just move over to the next slide. So we can kind of see from for Olawale, Rasheed had become like politicized, as he calls it. And part and parcel of that was also his meeting of David Majella. He also became part of the Black Workers Movement, which was formerly known as the Black Panthers. So he'd become embedded in kind of activist circles and kind of creators and artistic minds also who kind of were coming from things from the same approach as him. So in this work, When They Meet, Rasheed was photographing the National Front being protected by the police during a demonstration. Well, they were demonstrating against a meeting that was happening with the far right in Conway Hall in central London. This photographic series, Rasheed was trying to show the oppressive nature of the police and how people who pushed back against that were treated. But on reflecting on this work, Rasheed himself began to question himself and how he excluded his own struggle from this by documenting it. He wasn't putting himself within the frame. So he started to ask himself, okay, well, why don't I put myself in the frame, since this is my identity and this is what I'm up against? So in the next work, or the next slide, Rasheed fully confronted this idea. So in Portrait of the Artist as a Black Person, Rasheed critiqued the racism and discrimination against South Asian immigrants in the UK. During this performance, Rasheed had footage from Brick Lane. He had press cuttings about race-related attacks, portraits of his own family, and also you can kind of see in that image there that he also had included slides of his own structures, the lattice structures that he'd been working from over the years. So this kind of is a perfect example of how Rasheed, it's like a collision of his artistic identity, because he projects his structures over himself, almost like a cage. And the cage he kind of found himself artistically at the time, because he was trying to marry two sides of his identity in one. And he was realizing that they couldn't be separate, essentially. So then we'll just move on to the next slide. During this time, soon after the portrait of an artist, or portrait of an artist as a Black person, Rasheed also started a series of self-portraits. So he was taking the iconographic tradition of Western self-portraiture and turning it on his head by confronting, you can see on the image that he's added slurs. He's really kind of showing himself within the situation and marrying his identity with the confrontation with the viewer of the reality of that as a person. So he was making himself visible, which is interesting because Peter will talk about the publication Making Myself Visible, but this is him within his artistic practice, making himself visible to the viewer, but reclaiming the narrative by taking ownership of his identity and what the society he was living in, how he found himself within that. So that's kind of the end of the slides that I've put together. It's just to kind of give us a sense, idea of where Rasheed started and how he found himself up to 1978. At this time, himself and Mahmoud Jamal, who Peter will also discuss, they had made the first publication for Black Phoenix, which was a seminal publication. So this all kind of was the build up to Rasheed's critical writing and how he moved on into that side of his practice as well. So I'll hand over to Peter to discuss further.
Thanks, Majella. Where do I go from there? It's interesting because um, a lot of what we're talking about um, at the moment, Majella and myself, is the, we both work as artists. We've both been in education. We're both in academic circles. It's crossing these boundaries that we want to kind of share a bit as well. Um, should we go to my first slide of, we're going to whiz through them quite fast. The idea that we've talked about, Majella and myself, a lot is the idea of the artist's appraisal of another artist. And um, what does this mean? It means, how do we, as artists, also share our voice with other artists, with the artists themselves, with the history of those artists, the context, curators, museum directors, whatever. This doesn't happen as much as it ought at all. And artists like Rasheed, who are pioneers for all of the artists who we hold dear to us, have got a connection through him to different generations of artists. So we kind of want to talk about that, really. And when we say artist in this context, it's just because that's one word to use, but it could also mean thinker, writer, curator, scholar. It's collectively what we're thinking about is, how do we maintain a conversation between like-minded people who all don't necessarily want to just fit into the easy job description that's awaiting them, but maybe there's other ways to think about what our role could be collectively and individually. And it's also about, how does one find oneself as a person, as an artist, you name it, and how does one contextualize oneself? Seamus Fowle, an Irish artist, said in one of his catalogues that when an artist friend becomes successful, you must not ignore them or turn your back to them. And like, equally, when they're not being successful, it's the same thing. And I think that kind of describes what I'm talking about a lifelong experience of people and friends and communications that you have with people throughout a life, and how that changes, and how physically we need to sort of battle on and change that and find ways of dealing with that. Next slide, please. Sorry. So the other thing we're talking about and want to talk about very clearly is key works of Rasheed's. Key works also are in this case a collection of essays in the Triumph of Icarus. Artists are not just artists who make sculptures and paintings and prints in the studio. They're curators, they're writers, they're Gene Fishers, and we're talking about this actual collection of essays is a key work as well. And we'd like to present the idea that we should revisit all key works in all of their forms. We could have spent the day talking about that image of chakras, because it's such a key work for all of us, and yet we need to find a collective way of describing that work through our voice today. And when you look at the work of anybody like Rasheed, you realize it go through time in so many different ways. A structure that was made in the 60s is also a structure that could be made tomorrow. But it's the same sense of egalitarianism and an affront to certain forms of control. In this book, Triumph of Icarus, I mean, the first thing is the preface, which I can't say very well, which describes. Can we go to the next slide, please? It describes in an exhibition, which was sorry, I've got the details of an exhibition, Karlsruhe, in fact, where the piece of work moved to Berlin, and the two curators became very emotional about seeing this work, it was actually many third texts sitting on top of a series of structures from zero to infinity. So two works from different moments in time, from one person's lifetime, still growing, but proving that there's a philosophical side of an artist like Rasheed Araeen, who's dealing with many media in different ways. And what we're presenting is that when we read biographies of somebody like Rasheed Araeen, and they say he was the founding editor of Third Text, full stop, started Black Phoenix, full stop, pioneer of British minimalism, full stop. Those do not describe in any way something for us to kind of take forward. And what we want to confront is going back to these key works and actually talking about what the relationship actually has been of his work to these large statements like minimalism, etc., publishing, etc., etc. From an artist perspective, what does that really mean? And that's where it involves all of us somehow to find a currency and a way to talk about it today. It's funny because in the preface, Hans Belting and Andrea Budensieg also described the fact that in two of the third texts, Rasheed Araeen writes about the exhibition, his exhibition, The Other Story. In another third text, he publishes his essay, which is dealing with Magicians of the Earth, which was in two sites in Paris. I went to that. Maybe someone else went to that, but not all of us went to that. And it matters that we didn't, so we can talk about it and we can have fresh ideas about that. And his essay was called Our Bauhaus, Others' Mudhouse. I mean, the artists I know today are still talking about this show, wondering about this show. And when we look at the dates when these things happened, and we look at what's going on today, and when we look at the content of this amazing book, we ask ourselves, but has anything changed? What has changed? What are we doing? Why are we not the players, the people who know? Why are we not collectively part of that change? So, I mean, Jean Fisher talks about Muhammad Iqbal and how that reference to Rashid is so deep about, it says, this volume of essays is a celebration of Rasheed Araeen's multifaceted artistic career, one which confronted what the poet Iqbal describes as a difficult task of seeing the world, where the failure to see lies not in the artist's imagination, but in the institutions that frame art. And that's really interesting. We're not attacking institutions. We're talking about the fact that we should be playing a much larger part within what happens within said institutions and what institutions actually mean. Guy Brett's essay, he goes on to talk about the fact that Rasheed Araeen actually rejected the local version of professionalism in art, which became for him, or he saw it as a more or less bland imitation of Western modern art styles. He had no formal art training, meaning that his understanding of what an artist could be doesn't have to be someone who perhaps does it this way or that way, or continues a kind of way of doing it. And when we're looking at from a South Asian perspective here as well, and wondering what is the perspective, what is said professionalism, what is that shape for an artist, and how can that shape be talked about and maybe continue to be talked about. And that's the kind of thing that is extremely interesting, actually. If we can move on to a couple of slides. We've talked about third text a bit, and this is about that reading room piece of work, and we could go on a bit further, please. And this is Mahmoud Jamal, very, very good friend of Rasheed, a very good friend of us all. The poet and Rasheed sat down over coffee and they invented Black Phoenix. We can move on, please. This idea that they did it from the ground up, the DIY version, which outside of the actual system version, and yet they've done something that has sat neatly in so many institutions, and yet we forget the fact of how this came about. So it's a very important point. Can we move on, please, to the next one? This is number 2, a conversation with David Majella. Rasheed Araeen, in order to also finding a sense of himself as an artist, which we all have to do, in a deep appreciation of the works of others, whether they're philosophers, writers, friends, poets, in this case, David Majella, a very, very dear friend. And in many ways, they were mentors to each other. In this publication of Black Phoenix, which we've got it as the originals. I've reprinted it, all 3 again, for the retrospective, and it's now in one publication here. It's kind of amazing, really. If we whiz through the next, I think it's 6 slides, it just shows it wasn't just a quick off-the-knee jerk reaction of, I'll have a conversation with David Majella. This was a deep love of talking about his work and talking about him. So there's like almost the whole publication, or a large chunk, is dedicated to this conversation. I think this is a very important thing of how one recognizes oneself by looking at the context around oneself. And maybe not the things that you thought tell you who you are, but maybe, like Majella and I have worked with Rasheed, with many people in the studio, and that part of us, that part of our identity links us to curators like Cecil Bourne, Charlotte Cullen and Peter Lewis, and so many other people who continue to talk about these things. And so I think one finds a context for oneself, not an identity, but someone said to me recently in Paris, how do you recognize yourself in something, in a text or in the context? And I think when you get a chance to take yourself seriously and you write a press release about yourself and you talk about the people around you, the things you've done, that's how you find a sense of recognition, or as Rasheed would put it, a sense of visibility. So visibility being literally a universal thing that we all have. It's not about one of us. It's something we all actually have, the ability to tell a story, ability to be visible in different ways. So I think this is one of the biggest things that has moved many artists of different generations up to the new generation of Charlotte Martha and other younger artists still, is this idea of loving the works of other people as a kind of collaboration and continuing different forms of collaborations. And so this is just one example of Rasheed Araeen. His notion of collaboration with everybody he's worked with is in many ways a way that he could be recognized, even if he's an invisible person in that room. He's actually recognized by these collaborations, which have been cutting through age, gender, race, you name it. He's cut through all of them through those collaborations. We should go on a bit, sorry. Like this essential black art, I just got to read something quick. This exhibition actually toured to 6 cities in the UK in the 1980s. Emma Dexter writes in the preface, the aim of this exhibition is to clarify the nature of black art, isolating it as a specific contemporary art practice that has emerged as a result of the experience of our diaspora, racism and black struggle. Rasheed Araeen, who initiated the project, sees black art as political, ideological, and believes that it does not refer to the colour of race of the artist. I mean, this is really interesting stuff. This particular book, for me, really describes the love of chronology, the love of talking about what others have achieved, as well as how he sees his own achievements. And at the end, it's really fascinating. Gavin Yanchez says, the institutions are not the only makers of our future agenda. There is a contribution artists must make. When I say artists, again, that's us kind of people, together. There is a contribution that artists must make. I would like that contribution to be understood, not just in terms of bureaucratic engagement, but also, and more importantly, in what we create in our own studios. To rid all art of marginality requires a dedicated input in both fields. But it is not our skills in bureaucracy, but our skills in visually expressing our world that makes cultural reciprocity and a plural worldview possible. And I think those sentiments described in some of these catalogues are sentiments that seem to be much more appropriate to us today. Majella showed the image of when they came, but that's an image that she experiences every weekend in London, and it's 2025. So we're talking about this time space, and how do we look at that time space, and how do we challenge what has and what hasn't been done in terms of this amazing scholarship and collaborative work that he's been central to, and our contribution to that legacy collectively. Should we go on to the next one? There's only a few more slides here. Shamiana, and there's one more slide for that. This was the Shamiana in London. The thing that really, really excited Rasheed, or many things of this, was art parties, bringing art students, art historians, critics, philosophers, artists, writers together at a party. That was the main point of that physical sense of Shamiana as a permanent entity, was to create impermanence right in front of our eyes. And that just says it all, really. And And that's something I just wanted to remind us of, is that he expressed that wish to create those art parties. Noor was at them, we've all been at them together, we've all made friends at them. It's incredible. We could move on, please. So curriculum development, this is something Majella and I have talked about a lot, and it's nothing new to the oeuvre of Rasheed Araeen, who has always dealt with education and notions of education and wanting art history to engage with a fuller art history or a full story. So we're thinking of Olawale, Christmas Day, Portrait of the Artist as a Black Person, Shamiana. We worked with Shamiana with students and staff from Camberwell College of Arts for about 2 years. It was a BA Fine Art Drawing course. They took the risk and we took a risk, and it was fascinating. And you can't put what was achieved in a box. It was just what happens at Shamiana. Can we go on to the next slides quickly? So that's the Olawale. We know what a troublesome piece that was, but it's a piece of our history that we feel could be described and discussed at student level, all the way down to whatever age group we want. If the storytellers are able to tell a story, and we do have storytellers in the audience here, because I know, to be able to describe a piece of history to young people and describe that an artist did this means that their understanding of what an artist might be changes overnight. We can move on to the next one, please. The Portrait of the Artist as a Black Person. We reconstructed this piece in the studio, and it took us to many, many parts of British history. If we can move on to the next one, please. The Grunwick Strike, and there's another slide to this. This was actually led by J. Bean Desai, and this Grunwick Strike was a very, very important part of British history, a part of Union history of how workers who are Asian could speak out for themselves. And this is an element of the Grunwick. So when we take that piece of work apart with students, we can find out there's many bits of history which belongs to them, which we can share and talk about the current moment in time by looking at that piece of history. These are artworks which are not actually presented in the way that we feel they should be presented or could be presented. Next slide, please. Christmas Day, I'm really talking to all of us who've had parents, parents who may have moved from one country to another, parents who may have been unemployed or been on the outskirts of anything. This Christmas Day, we have this in the studio. It's one of the saddest things ever to walk past every day. It's a reminder of what that feeling of invisibility really is. So in this piece, Rasheed is photographing himself in the reflection. I mean, that feeling of loneliness, or that's what moving from job to job, place to place. In the portrait of the artist of the Black person, there's an image which says mother. I mean, it's really about what this is about. It's not a political act. It's not a flag waving exercise. Say, look at me. It's actually a very, very complicated, deep, philosophical, human experience going through these processes. And I think that we, as another generation who hopefully don't have to do that, but we can still feel it because it's in our DNA of people who felt it. It means that there's something there we can talk to people about, that we can bring into a curriculum and into storytelling in many, many ways. Young people are not fools. They deserve to be given the facts. And our job is to give those facts over as many times in as many different ways and repeat ourselves if we have to. And that's called education, really, a good version. So I think there's one or two last slides. Yeah, this piece, I just love this. And I'm not going to read it because we're running out of time, but there was a British Council show in Paris, and it was about, does it exist, British art? And of course, it completely excluded anyone who wasn't a white artist. It's as simple as that. So Rasheed wrote blacks out, blacks out, blacks out on the we, and made this rather fantastic piece of art, actually. And that was made in 1979. And that just says, so if that was made then, what is our role today? What has been achieved? What hasn't been achieved? So I think it's an amazing moment in history to say, so that and other works of his, texts, scholarship around his work, what has that led us to do today? And I think that's a really important point, and that's what Majella and I want to kind of take further, and to create sort of more discussion and a publication and exhibitions, you name it, about. So if this all of this scholarship has happened, how can we really look back at the scholarship itself, the artworks themselves? Not how do we neatly put them into our museums, into our exhibitions. Because when you bring a couple of artists and younger curators or more radical curators into that conversation, then you really start to talk about the work. You don't talk about how the work can bring people in. You talk about the work itself. I think that's the point. I think we're nearly at the end of this. Oh yeah. Is that okay? We can't hear you, Kuhu.
Hello?
Hello. That's better.
Yes. Sorry, I don't know. I wasn't able to unmute myself, but thank you so much. That is a lot to think about, and thank you for putting it there, framing Rashid's work so beautifully. I would like to ask the audience to please um, type in their questions, and I'll get the ball rolling and ask the first one. When we decided to do this talk, this was a question that I had thought of even before the talk was conceptualized, that Rashid's work is getting an increased engagement in from when he'd done the retrospective in 2017. The publication actually has a piece specifically dedicated to the 1970s art practice, and why that is, because these works are, and maybe you've touched on it a little bit, but if we can elaborate how these works are so politically specific, but still resonate with us today, and why it's important to talk about them today.
Majella, you're on
Either
mute.
of you.
Oh, yeah. You go ahead first, Madge.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, within the context we find ourselves at the moment and the world we see, I think it's quite obvious that there's been a failure from tackling imperialism. You know, it only goes so far. I think it's, you know, we don't have to say too much about that, but it's very evident that, you know, you have people and artists like Rasheed who have been pushing and trying to get, you know, his critical writings, you know, these studies about how we find ourselves, and the context of imperialism, both in the art world and in society in general. But throughout the years, these haven't been integrated, as Peter touched on there. They haven't been integrated into the education system, particularly for younger generations. So I think, you know, finding yourself as an art student or as a university student, at university level, suddenly being confronted possibly with questions about, you know, British, in particular, imperialism. If you've never learnt about that in your whole life, I think it's very telling that now we find ourselves in a position where we do now, because if you don't lay those fundamentals, and if you don't have a fundamental understanding from a young age, of that, it's very difficult to tackle it and to confront it at a later stage. So I think that there's definitely failing from the systems, from institutions, for ignoring particularly Rasheed's writings. I think we're left with a lot to deal with now, and to try and push it forward and make sure that's integrated better. And then, yeah, in general, I think, you know, Rasheed's work was ignored for such a long time, particularly his political works, because I think it's difficult for institutions who have ignored them to then embrace it, because they have to question their own role in that, essentially. So I think there's a lot of things to touch on with that, but yeah, that's kind of how I see it. And, you know, that was Rasheed's first ever retrospective in the UK, which is mind blowing. You know, that was what, 2018. So yeah, there's a lot of things that we could say on it, but I'll pass over to Peter.
It's also interesting because you look at the images themselves, the actual as visual art, and you think of the studio space in the studio where people might be making visual art, and there might be another floor upstairs where there might be historians, or another floor where there might be writing thesis, and you bring it all together and you think, well, maybe that's a shape we should be talking about. It's not visual art in that sense. It's about us. It's about our relationship responsibilities collectively. And you look at the oeuvre and the body of work of a man like Rasheed, and there are other artists who've done other things like this, where they brought outside non-art things into this body. And it's that ignorance that we've continued to sort of not see sort of people collectively, but be able to break us down. It's the ultimate imperial thing of break everything down and conquer them. And that's what's happened massively. So conversations that should be happening are not happening because our own disciplines are being seen as different, and we should all be around the same dinner table, quite frankly. And that could begin at primary school level up. And I think, and we have to begin at the start, and it takes time. But it's maybe time to begin. That's what we're saying. There has been massive failures, and there are jobs available for people, but maybe they shouldn't take them. Maybe they should decide on a more DIY version and link in with others, and then link in and do something different. But we keep walking into the same tunnel, all of us. And I think it takes great courage not to do that. But I think as we've been so dissipated, this great forum here is an example of how maybe we could just start sharing some conversations, and then we'll soon realize how powerful we are collectively, if not seen by the hegemon, but seen by ourselves in our own recognition of what we can and what we should be achieving. I first met Rasheed in Rotterdam. I was with Cecile Bourne, the curator, and the artist Seamus Farrell. I got to know him there. I heard him speak at conferences. I went to see him years later and asked if we could have all of third text in an artwork we made in Rotterdam. And then after I came back from France, I just started helping him out with a few bits and pieces, which were pretty important. And years later, I knew Majella well. She joined the team. But within that team, there's been lots of artists and writers and curators who we all meet together there, but it's still not recognized as being actually terribly important. And that's the point we're bringing across somehow with these, looking at these other artworks, which do not fit a category, but they sort of fit our category, whatever that is.
Yeah, yeah, that I completely agree with that. That a lot of artists still come here because it's London is the space for international art, but it's sort of a duality that at the same time it sort of misses um, real happening places and people, and I guess in its categorization, it just doesn't um, have space. um, I'd I also wanted to ask about why. Well, I guess you've answered the institutional question as well, so maybe I'll skip that. But before we move on to audience questions, I wanted to ask how Rasheed's work, how working and collaborating with Rasheed have has impacted your own practice, and what have you taken or borrowed from him?
You go first, Majella.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, what can I say about Rasheed? It's hard to just kind of say only a few words about how influential he has been. And actually, also, I have to say, Peter as well has been incredibly influential in my practice as an artist too. But yeah, I think from a personal point of view, I kind of like came to London and found similarities once I had discovered Rasheed's work in how I felt how I felt myself in this society. And that's coming from an Irish white perspective, so completely different. So I was quite shocked when I moved here how different and how alien I actually felt, particularly in the art world. Something just didn't sit right with me, particularly in the art institution that I went to. It just didn't feel like it was dealing with things related to society. It felt you know, quite, let's be polite about this, but yeah, it was dealing with aesthetics and style over substance, in my opinion. But then when Peter had introduced me to Rasheed, it was almost like coming home. I felt it was like a light bulb moment. I understood why I felt alien, and then just seeing, you know, how Rasheed takes that, but you know, really puts it to the next level and confronts. And I think it gave me that comfort to say, you know what, even if I'm not accepted with the work I make, I have that confidence and a reason behind trying to make works that I feel like are a bit more confrontational. Um, and yeah, just seeing how Rasheed operates in the art world as well, you know, he really takes no prisoners, but I think in a good way. It's not out of malice, it's not out of him trying to, you know, be hostile. He does it in a way that I think is necessary, and it makes change. And you know, he's been ahead of his time for many years. He still is. He's not. He just turned 90 a couple of weeks ago, and you know, we're about to publish a book called Art and Institutional Racism. So, you know, that just gives an indication as to how prolific he is and how he knows the work isn't done. And I think that's influenced both myself and Peter, both in our practice and as colleagues of his, to understand that there's still an awful lot of work to be done. So, yeah, sorry, I'll ramble, but I'll hand over to Peter.
And the studio still is a place of many collaborations. You know, when Rasheed suddenly said, I want to make some neons, so I contact an artist who's an expert on neons, and Majella and I, you know, we contact someone like Kylie if there's something we can't find. It's like it's he calls it a family. It is a kind of family, and it's like we have to have that cottage industry feeling. Those pieces of work that are made are his works, and they will be, and they will feel like his works. And we're both artists, but also in a sense of curating artists, we know how work has to be because it's his work. We never speak for him. We speak, you know, for ourselves in other ways about our own things that we're dealing with. I mean, he's influenced me in many ways, actually. Yeah, he's a pioneer, and there are other pioneers for me, like Derek Jarman, who's also deeply influenced me. And I think when you bring pioneers together, you often realize that they do their work, then there's a huge gap, and then their work isn't really looked at correctly. And then years later, maybe it will be looked at correctly. Unfortunately, they're not always around to be part of that. So it's still a continuing problem that we have. But I've talked to Rasheed a lot about my own sort of. I'm of a, you know, my mum's Anglo-Indian, and I've taught for many years, and I've worked with great curators and experienced living abroad a lot and seen a lot of art that people in the UK haven't seen and never will see, and made connections with people that many people will never make. I think we were in Paris a couple of weeks ago, and I think it came very clear to us that we're too disconnected from each other and from the people we want to share time with, from that human connection. And there is a human connection, and that's the thing that really came across to my friends in Paris, that you know, we really do not see enough of each other or find ways to share what we know. I mean, the biggest influence, I guess, from Rasheed has been trying not to be afraid of certain things or not being afraid to stand up. And I think that is a big deal for all of us, and it works in different ways for all of us in different ways.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. We have a comment from Kylie Gilchrist. And a question as well. Thanks so much for this wonderful journey through Rashid's work. I found the insight that being visible for Rashid was really about being within and being seen with a wider context really important. To also flip the point around, I'd love to hear you say a bit more about what context Rashid also makes visible, artistically, but also intellectually and politically. It's you again, Majella.
Yeah, I guess I mean, because of Rashid, you know, he makes himself visible in the sense that his work's confronted, but I think it lives on through his writings, and how he's trying to affect the historical and the institutional kind of conversation around visibility. Um, and yeah, I think all of his writings are constantly a push towards a kind of visibility of that conversation, which I think is still being had and still isn't resolved. But it is something that is, I think, his way of like making visible the struggle and the oppression that still happens to this day.
I think you've said it really well because it's really making visible that conversation. And the philosophical side of Rasheed Araeen is very deep, and there will be a publication by Peter Lewis talking about that coming out because the person in a way continues to be like that image in Christmas Day. The person is still there creating a conversation, participation, which I think is another word we can go beyond if we talk more about Rashid's work. But that visibility of him is in our participation. He makes the work and we deal with it. We look at it, we learn from it. So it's a different kind of visibility that is deeply philosophical as well. And I think Majella sort of touched upon it in the way that then says, yes, so the rest of the work is for us to now do. We laughed about this when he was in hospital, where he said, "Well, I can't do everything." And I said, "I know you can't, but we're here to do stuff with you and to take this idea like the Mediterranean project, and then we should deal with that. And then he can set it up. He sets up the bits, the setting, the theatricality of that, and he loves it. And then he loves the fact that other people can come and get involved in his work and take that work forward. I mean, he gets great joy out of it, doesn't he, Madge?"
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. We have someone called F. Murray. They say, thank you very much for the talk, Peter and Marge. I'm sorry I was late and couldn't follow what you have said. But specifically, when they joined, Peter said something in the Q&A to the that said, sorry, you said something along the lines to look at his art correctly, to look at Rashid Areen's art correctly. What do you mean by that? Could you elaborate on that?
I think collectively, as well as correctly, I think collectively is, and go back to whether it's whether it's a work of art, an image, a photograph, a sculpture, a structure, or whether it's a set of essays that other people have written about their response to him and his work, is, I think correctly for me, is to actually go back to look at and to share the reading of and looking at pieces of work which are dissipated all over the world. That's not an innocent thing. That's a thing that happens. They're all over the world. To bring some of those things physically together so that someone can stand in front of them and have them in front of them, not in a book, not on a slideshow like this, that matters, and correctly begins with the opportunity for lovely people to get a chance to go to a retrospective, which is maybe not a retrospective, but something different. That's just a word we use that actually means very little, in fact. We know what it means. It doesn't mean a good thing, actually. But to go correctly to certain sets of work that have been put together through scholarship, which allow us to kind of share the reading of it and to have a discourse around it, which we don't, whatever space has put that show on, their role is to make sure that people get around the table and look at that work correctly and think about what then they could do with that work. I suppose that's a thing that we feel very deeply about, is certain works will not be seen, and that's a real problem.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, showing up is very important. Even as an audience member, I have been guilty. I mean, in a space like London, you can be guilty of missing things, and it's really important to make time and meet people. Um, Thank you so much for this conversation. I'm going to end our session here. But before I do, I think somebody in the comments, Mohammed Tariq, asked, how is Rashid doing? And is he well? So How is he?
Yeah, no, he's doing absolutely fantastic, thankfully. Yeah, he's not going to the studio as much as usual, but he is an absolute voracious reader. I go to see him most days, and he has a new book every day, from Ulysses to Mondrian to everything in between. Yeah, he flies through them. So no, he's doing very well, and hopefully, in the near future, we will be sending out emails to everybody about the publication of his upcoming book, which is definitely gonna be, yeah,
Very
and be
exciting.
confrontational, shall we say, but it's in the best way. So yeah, he's doing great.
Okay. Thank you so much, Peter and Majella. Really, it was very insightful, and um, we're very delighted to have been able to host this conversation. I'm gonna, like I said, I'm gonna end this session now. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining. This
Thank
session
you.
is being recorded and will be uploaded on YouTube, and we will share on our social media when it does. So please follow us at Art South Asia Project. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank
Have a
you.
lovely day. Bye.
Thank you.